This is the story of Lucas Bennett and his wife Hannah Pierce Bennett. Hannah had loved Lucas the way people love a house they've lived in too long. Not with fire, but with the particular comfort of knowing which floorboards creak, which windows stick in the rain. They had built something real together. She and Lucas. Something that looked whole from the outside, and mostly felt whole from the inside. Except in those quiet moments before sleep when Hannah would stare at the ceiling and feel, without being able to name it, that she had slowly become invisible inside her own life. Lucas was not a cruel man. That was the hardest part. He was distracted and busy and tired in the way that men who work too much are tired. Thoroughly, righteously, without apology. And Hannah had learned to need less, then less again. Until needing felt like an indulgence she couldn't afford. What unravels here is not dramatic. It is the story of a woman who stopped being seen and what happened when someone finally looked. The stadium was loud in that particular afternoon way, not the roaring crescendo of a close game, but the ambient noise of thousands of people eating, talking, half watching. Hannah Pierce Bennett had brought her son alone. Caleb was 9 and obsessed with baseball in the consuming way that 9-year-old boys are obsessed with things. Encyclopedically, evangelically, slightly exhausting. He had memorized batting averages, could recite starting lineups from 3 seasons back, and had been talking about this particular game since Tuesday. Lucas had promised to come. Lucas had called it noon to say he couldn't. It wasn't a fight. They didn't fight anymore. Not really. She had said okay and meant something more complicated than that. And then she'd bought a hot dog for Caleb and found their seats in section 114, row F, and told herself that she was fine, which was mostly true, and that the afternoon would be good anyway, which was also mostly true. The seats were close, the day was warm without being brutal, and Caleb was already standing on his seat cushion when the man sat down beside her. He did so quietly. That was the first thing she noticed. People don't sit quietly in baseball stadiums. They shuffle and knock elbows and spill things. But this man folded himself into the plastic seat with a kind of practiced unobtrusiveness, as if he'd spent years learning not to take up space. He was older than her by perhaps 15 years, with gray coming in at the temples and the particular stillness of someone who'd stopped trying to prove things. He wore a plain navy jacket over a collared shirt. No team gear. No phone immediately out. "Is the seat taken?" he asked, though he was already sitting, which struck her as oddly courteous. "It is now," she said, not unkindly. He smiled at that. Not the reflexive, social smile she was used to, but something quieter, like she'd said something that genuinely landed. "Victor Langley," he said, and extended a hand. "Hannah." She didn't give her last name. She wasn't sure why. Victor Langley. If that was really his name, if people actually introduced themselves by full name at baseball games, turned his attention to the field. And Hannah appreciated that he didn't try to make it more than it was. They watched an inning in companionable silence. Caleb explained in detail why the current pitcher's mechanics were slightly off. Victor listened, which also surprised her. "He's got good instincts," Victor said, nodding toward Caleb. "He gets it from somewhere that isn't me," Hannah said. "I didn't know what an ERA was until 2 years ago. And now? Now I know more than I ever intended to." She smiled, and it reached her eyes in a way that smiles hadn't always done lately. They talked, loosely, without agenda. He asked what she did. She said she managed operations for a mid-sized logistics firm downtown, a role she'd grown into and was quietly proud of, though she'd been passed over for a director position twice in 3 years. He nodded without filling the silence with platitudes. She mentioned Caleb's school, the budget cuts, the way the arts program had quietly disappeared last semester. Victor asked a few careful questions, the kind that suggested he was actually listening, not constructing his next sentence while she spoke. He didn't ask about a husband, she didn't mention one. When the 7th inning stretch came, Caleb asked for another hot dog, and Hannah stood to take him, turning briefly back. "It was nice talking," she said, and meant it with the slightly melancholy weight of things that are pleasant, precisely because they're temporary. Victor nodded. "Enjoy the rest of the game, Hannah." She walked away thinking nothing of it, or telling herself she wasn't. That night, Lucas asked how the game was from behind his laptop screen, and she said fine, and they ate dinner in the particular quiet of two people who have stopped working very hard at each other. Caleb chattered about the pitcher's mechanics. Lucas said in the right places. Hannah washed the dishes and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, watching the dark backyard, thinking about nothing specific. That was the thing about the cracks in a life. They didn't announce themselves. They were just there one day when the light hit a certain way. 3 weeks later, Hannah's supervisor called her into his office to tell her the director position was opening again and that her name was on the short list. She drove home with that information sitting in her chest like something warm and fragile. She wanted to tell someone. She wanted, specifically, to tell Lucas and to have him understand what it meant. Not just the title or the salary, but what it meant to her, the years of doing more than was asked. The quiet accumulation of competence in rooms where she'd often been the only woman, and sometimes the youngest person, and always the one who stayed late. Lucas was cooking when she got home, which she took as a good sign. He cooked when he was in decent spirits, when the project wasn't imploding, when he remembered that they had a house and a life that required tending. "Good day?" he asked. "Actually, yeah." She set down her bag. "Gareth called me in. The director role is open again. He said my name is—" "Which director role? The one they filled with Connors 2 years ago? They're restructuring the department. It's a different scope now, actually bigger. I thought you said that whole division was a mess." She paused. "I said the transition was messy. It's settled down." "Right." He stirred something on the stove. "You think they'll actually give it to you this time, or are they just—" "I don't know, Lucas." Her voice came out more clipped than she intended. "I just found out today." He turned to look at her, and she could see him recalibrating, recognizing that he'd stepped on something, though not entirely sure what. "I'm just saying, you've been down this road before. I don't want to see you get your hopes up and then—" "I know. I remember." She moved to the refrigerator, opened it, looked at nothing. "It was good news. I was happy about it. I just wanted to tell you." The sentence landed between them like something that couldn't be unsaid. Lucas put down the spoon. "I'm glad you told me. It was the right thing to say. It was also, somehow, the wrong thing. The timing, the register. He'd said it like a man correcting course rather than a man who meant it." She set the table and called Caleb down from his room, and they ate the dinner that Lucas had cooked, which was good, genuinely good. And she thought about how this was what people on the outside would see: a nice dinner, a husband who cooked, a son who talked enthusiastically about his day, the geometry of a functional marriage. She thought briefly about the man at the baseball game. Victor. She hadn't thought about him since that afternoon. Or told herself she hadn't. What she'd actually done was notice, once or twice in the intervening weeks, the specific quality of his attention. The way he'd asked about her job not to fill silence, but because he'd wanted to understand it. She thought, that was nothing. That was a stranger at a baseball game. She also thought, I came home with good news today, and I felt worse after telling it. She looked up from her plate, and for just a moment, strange, unbidden, she felt as though she were being watched. Not by Lucas, by something else. Some larger attention she couldn't name. "I don't know," she said quietly, to no one in particular. Maybe like this story. Or subscribe, or something." Caleb looked up. "What?" "Nothing." She shook her head. "Sorry. I'm tired." Lucas hadn't looked up from his phone. The next morning, she got an email from an address she didn't recognize. "Miss Pierce Bennett. I hope this doesn't feel intrusive. We met briefly at the Greystone game last month. I'm in the process of building out a leadership team for a company expansion and was told your name came up through a mutual contact. I'd be glad to have a conversation if you're open to it. No pressure either way. V. Langley." She read it twice, then a third time. She sat with the mild, complicated feeling of being found, which is different from being sought, and different still from being seen. She typed 3 different responses and deleted them all. Then she typed a 4th. "Mr. Langley, I remember. I'm listening." She hit send before she could talk herself out of it. The coffee meeting was in a quiet place on Arlen Street that Hannah wouldn't have found on her own. Small, unhurried, the kind of place designed for conversations that needed room to breathe. Victor was already there when she arrived. He stood when he saw her, and that, too, was the old courtesy she'd been slowly forgetting people practiced. They talked for 2 hours. She had expected something with the texture of a job interview, and instead found something more like a conversation between two people who had both grown tired of performing. Victor told her what he was building, an operational division within his company, Langley Group, meant to handle a portfolio expansion he'd been planning for 3 years. He needed someone who understood systems and people in equal measure. Someone who didn't mistake efficiency for leadership. "What made you reach out to me specifically?" she asked, about 40 minutes in. "You don't know my professional record." He considered this with the same pause she'd noticed in section 114. Genuinely considering, not performing consideration. "I noticed things. In 3 innings? You'd be surprised what 3 innings tells you." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "You were alone with your son at a game your husband was supposed to attend. You weren't performing contentment. You weren't performing resentment. You were just present." He paused. "The way you talked about your work, you were proud without being defensive. That's rarer than it sounds." She looked at him carefully. "This is an unusual hiring process. I'm an unusual employer. That's either reassuring or alarming." "Probably both," he said, and smiled again in that way she'd noticed before, like something had landed. She told him more than she'd intended. About the director position she'd been passed over for, about the ways she'd made herself smaller in meetings and watched men with less experience get credited for things she'd laid the groundwork for. Not bitterly. She was past bitterness, had metabolized it into something more useful, a kind of cold clarity about how rooms worked and what they required of her. Victor listened in a way that felt different from Lucas's listening, and she had to be careful about that. Careful not to romanticize a professional conversation simply because she was hungry for a particular quality of attention. She drove home and told Lucas about it over dinner. He put down his fork. "Who is this person?" "I told you we met at the game. Caleb and I went." I know you went." Something careful and watchful moved across his face. "A stranger emailed you out of nowhere with a job offer." "A conversation." He was clear it was exploratory. "How did he get your email?" "He said a mutual contact." "Who?" "I don't know who, Lucas. People know people." He sat back. She could see him working through something, and she recognized the specific shape of what it was. Not jealousy exactly, but its quieter cousin, the discomfort of realizing that his wife existed in rooms he hadn't thought about. "I just think you should be careful," he said. "I am careful," she said. "I've been careful for 10 years. The sentence had more edges than she'd intended. They both felt them. "I didn't mean, I know." She picked up her fork. "I know what you meant." They finished dinner. She did not mention that she was going to a second meeting the following week. Not because she was hiding it, she told herself, because there wasn't anything yet to say. But somewhere beneath that reasonable logic, there was something she didn't want examined. The desire to keep one corner of her life where she wasn't yet someone's wife, someone's mother, someone who could be carefully warned. The floorboards of a house you've lived in too long. You know which ones creak. She just hadn't decided yet whether she was trying to avoid them or walk directly across them to hear the sound. She took the position. The process had been longer than she expected. 3 conversations with Victor, 2 with his legal team, one afternoon at the Langley Group offices where she'd walked through their operational structure and found, to her private astonishment, that she understood intuitively where the fractures were and how she would approach them. She had driven home afterward with the particular feeling of a key turning in a lock she hadn't known she'd been carrying. Lucas was less opposed than she'd anticipated. He was, by then, more distracted than ever. The project he'd been managing for 2 years was entering its final critical phase, and he came home late and left early and moved through their house like a man solving a problem in his head continuously. when she told him she was accepting the role. He said, "That's good, hon," and she thought, "This is what we've become. Each other's peripheral life." She didn't say that. She said thank you and went upstairs. She was good at the job. Better than good. She had suspected she might be, in the guarded way that competent people sometimes let themselves hope. But it was different to feel the machinery of her own capability working at the scale it was designed for. She hired carefully, built processes that held weight, made decisions without the constant low-level second-guessing that had characterized the last 3 years of her previous role. Victor was a present but non-intrusive presence. He asked incisive questions and then stepped back. He credited her publicly and accurately. He never made her feel like a project. She was 6 weeks in when his assistant, a steady woman named Carolyn, mentioned offhandedly that Mr. Langley had been considering this hire for the better part of a year. "I only met him in March," Hannah said. "Right." Carolyn glanced up. "He mentioned that, the game. He was looking for someone before that, though?" He had a profile. He'd been looking for someone with a particular combination of qualities. Someone who could manage under-resourced situations without losing the human element. Carolyn smiled at something private. "He said he knew the afternoon he met you." Hannah sat with that information for a week before she asked Victor about it directly. They were in his office, late on a Thursday, reviewing quarterly projections. "Carolyn mentioned something," she said. He looked up from the spreadsheet. "She said you'd been building a profile before we met." A pause. Not uncomfortable. That was what struck her about it. He wasn't embarrassed. He was deciding how much truth to carry into the room. "I was looking for specific qualities," he said, "not a person. And then you met a person. And then I met a person who had all of them." He closed the folder. "I want to be clear that nothing you experienced in that process was manufactured. The conversations we had, the instincts I observed, I wasn't running tests. I was paying attention." "That feels like a thin line." "Maybe," he said, "but I knew fairly quickly that it was you specifically, not the role filled. You." She absorbed this. "That should probably bother me more." "You're deciding if it does." "I'm deciding," she agreed. She drove home later and sat in the driveway for a moment before going inside. The kitchen light was on. Lucas would be up, probably on his laptop, probably half present in that way he'd perfected. She thought about what Victor had said. Paying attention. The difference between being observed and being seen. The way those two things could look identical from the outside and feel completely different from the inside. She thought about 10 years of a marriage that had worked, that had produced a son and a house and a shared history of quiet dinners and occasional good weekends, and how working and thriving were not the same word. She wasn't in love with Victor Langley. That would have been simpler in its way. A cleaner story with a cleaner villain. What she felt was more disorienting than that. She felt in his professional company like the most competent invisible version of herself. She felt in her own house like a well-maintained appliance. She did not tell herself that was Lucas's fault entirely. She had done her own retreating, her own preemptive diminishing. You could not spend years making yourself smaller and then blame only the room. But you could, eventually, decide to take up space again. She went inside. Lucas looked up from his laptop. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. The distance between those two words was not measured in feet. It was a Sunday in November when things were finally said. Not shouted, not performed, said, in the quiet, particular way that long marriages sometimes arrive at truth, through sheer exhaustion of the alternative. Caleb was at his friend Marcus's house. The morning had been overcast and still. Lucas had made coffee and left a mug on the counter for her without being asked, which was either a kindness or a habit, and she wasn't certain he knew which. She came downstairs and found him sitting at the kitchen table, not working, which was unusual enough that she paused in the doorway. "I've been thinking," he said. "Okay, about the last couple years. He stopped, started again. "About whether I've been present." She sat down across from him. She did not say finally, "or you think," or any of the things that the angry version of herself had rehearsed on bad nights. She sat down and looked at him and waited, because he deserved that, at minimum. "I don't think I have," he said. "Been present." "No," she said, gently. "Not really. Is it fixable?" The question landed in the space between them, and she felt the specific weight of it. How much hope was packed into 4 words. How much he must have had to put down his defenses to ask it. How much she wished the answer were simpler. "I don't know," she said. He looked at his coffee cup. "Are you—" He seemed to be deciding whether to finish the sentence. "Is there something with Langley? Or is that—" "No," she said, and meant it. "It's not that. But I spent 10 years feeling like I was disappearing," she said. "And then I took a job and found out I was still there. And now I don't know what to do with both of those things at once." Lucas was quiet for a long time. She watched him process it, not defensively, which surprised her, but with a kind of exhausted recognition, like a man who'd been half aware of a structural problem in a wall and was finally seeing the crack clearly. "I kept telling myself we were fine," he said. "I know. I told myself busy meant okay. That functional meant I know, Lucas." "I didn't want to see it," she nodded. "Neither did I. For a long time." They sat with that for a while. The coffee cooled. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere down the block, someone's dog barked twice and went quiet. "What do you want?" he asked finally. It was the question she'd been waiting for him to ask for years. Now that it was here, she found it more complex than she'd expected, because she had spent so long knowing what she lacked that she hadn't fully worked out what she wanted instead. "I want to be seen," she said. "Not managed, not optimized. Seen. I can try to." "I know you can try." She looked at him steadily. "I don't know if trying is the same as changing. I don't know if I know the difference anymore. So what does that mean?" "I think it means we have to figure out whether there's still enough here to build something new. And I don't know the answer." She paused. "I'm not sure I can promise you what the answer is going to be." It was not a verdict. She had thought, when she'd imagined this conversation in darker moments, that it would feel like one, like the end of something, like a gavel coming down. It felt instead like standing at the top of a staircase she hadn't climbed before, unable to see the bottom, not ready to descend. Lucas nodded, very slowly. She could see him absorbing the dimensions of what she'd said, not the accusation, because there hadn't been one, but the scope of the distance, and the work that crossing it would require, if it could be crossed at all. "I don't want to lose you," he said. "I know." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Briefly, without it being a promise. Then she stood and took her coffee to the window and looked out at the gray November yard, and the trees standing bare and patient in the way that trees wait out every season without urgency. Later that day, she would get an email from Carolyn with notes for Monday's planning session. She would reply with 2 annotated documents and a question about the Pittsburgh expansion timeline. She would be good at her job. She would pick up Caleb at Marcus's house and listen to him talk about a game they played. And she would be present for that, genuinely, in the way she was trying to be present for everything now. She did not know what would happen to her marriage. She knew that not knowing was honest, and honest was what she had left. The trees stood bare in the yard. She stood at the window. She looked and was looked at by nothing, and let that be enough for now. Some things don't end with a door closing. They end with 2 people at a kitchen table, in the quiet, choosing finally to be truthful, and finding that truth, while clarifying, does not always resolve. Hannah Bennett had stopped disappearing. Whether that left room for what she and Lucas had built was a question the season hadn't answered yet. Some questions are like that. They stay open, past the last page, past the silence at the end of the conversation, asking to be lived through rather than solved.